we have an energy mixer in the water sector. I think this crisis is going to take us away from the highly centralized one source option. Now let's start understanding the economics of this. There's a number of factors in understanding the economics of the different resources. And I think the simplest way to understand this now is let's first talk about Economics 101. And Economics 101 will say that for any project to be viable in the water space, and I guess this is true whether you're making widgets or bubble gum or whatever it is that you're making, the larger the volume throughput, the lower the unit cost. So there's an inverse relationship between throughput and cost. To make a few, it's going to cost you more. To make a lot, it's going to cost you less per unit. And the second thing that's important is the longer the payback time, the lower the unit cost. And here we think of a motor car. If you go and buy, for example, a cell phone, or you go and buy a motor car, or you buy a house, each of those things are capital items that you acquire, and each of them has got a different financial solution. You will not buy a cell phone with a financial instrument that's going to take you 30 years to pay back. You're going to pay back in 24 months or maybe 36 months. You're not going to buy a house with the same instrument that you use to buy your cell phone. So the payback period is critically important. Now let's apply that to these two technologies. The two technologies we're looking at tonight are groundwater on the one hand and desalination on the other. So let's start off with desalination. Unfortunately, the way that the terms of reference were set up, either deliberately or not, I don't know. That's an open question right now. But the way that the terms of reference were set up deliberately defined a number of parameters that skewed the findings against desalination. How was this manifest? It was manifest by two things. Number one, it was said that there will be a lot of decentralized small units. Therefore, at no time would you reach that critical mass of a big enough volume throughput in order to make it viable. That's very, very important to understand. So there are lots of small little package plants. Each one's going to give a relatively small volume. Therefore, none of them can ever reach that sweet spot of efficiency. The second thing is that for reasons I'm told that were defined by the Public Financial Management Act, the agreement, the offtake agreement, could only be 24 months. So now you're buying a motor car using a cell phone instrument, using a cell phone payment instrument. So therefore, you're paying back a high capital cost in a very short space of time. And I've been told as a result of this that desalination costs come in at 40 Rand per cubic meter. Now, if anyone watched Carte Blanche just a short while ago, you'll see that the plant that was offered by Israel to Cape Town comes in a little bit over 10 Rand a cubic meter. So that's a big difference between 40 and 10. Why? Because of the volume, because of the scale, because of the payback period. Okay, now let's apply that now to groundwater. Now think of groundwater as a great big underground spongy-like rock layer. But think of it as a sponge. And that sponge is confined by certain geological features, and it's got a known volume in it. So now you've got to get that volume out. So think of drinking that volume out of the sponge with the number of drinking straws, because a borehole is none other than a straw. Now you've got a big volume of water. Let's just say it's a gazillion liters, whatever it is, big volume of water. Now your studies will show you've got this huge big volume of water. And now the question comes, how do you get it out of the ground? So you've now got to have boreholes. Now, do you have one borehole? Do you have 10 boreholes? Do you have 100? Do you have 1,000? Each of these boreholes is a production unit in and of itself. And every production unit requires certain things. So let's quickly go through it from a costing perspective. The first thing you have to do is you have to drill the borehole. You first have to site the borehole. So where are we going to do it? X marks the spot, put it there. Right, there's a cost involved in that. Secondly, we're now going to get permission from the landowner. So to do that, you need a servitude. That can take time, and that's a legal thing. It has to be registered on the deeds at the deeds office. There's a legal cost, and there's a time involved. Now you've got to drill a borehole, and there's a cost involved. Typically, ballpark number that I know of in the Gauteng area, a borehole will cost you between 30 and 50,000 Rand just to drill. Now you have to equip the borehole. So you've got a hole in the ground. Hopefully you found water, because not all boreholes have got water. Now you have to put casing down. So there's a cost for casing. And then you have, because the casing holds the top unconsolidated layers of earth in place, prevents them from falling into the hole until you get down into the hard rock. So there's a cost involved in that. Then you have to put a pump in it. Now, how much do you pump? What is the volume that borehole can give? Well, you don't know until you've got the hole in the ground, until you've pumped and done what they call a yield test. Only then can you now say this borehole gives, of the gazillion liters underground, this borehole gives us 10 liters a second over a 24-hour production cycle or an 18-hour production cycle or whatever. Only then can you now say, right, if that is the production yield of this borehole, how many boreholes do we need in the well field? Could need 100, could need 1,000. You don't know. You just don't know that. So every borehole is a production unit. Every borehole has got a finite cost. And I would say as a rough ballpark number, just as a thumbsuck number, a typical borehole drilled, sited, and equipped will cost you in the order of plus minus 100,000 rand, just as a ballpark number. So now you've got the borehole in the ground. It's now producing water, but now you need two other things. Well, in fact, you need three other things. The first thing that you need is you've got to get that water from that borehole into your reticulation system. So you need a piping structure. Pipes have to go over ground, so you need a servitude. You now have to negotiate servitude because let's say you've got 100 boreholes, let's say you've got 1,000 boreholes. That's 100 or 1,000 servitudes you have to negotiate. Each of them, very, very complex, and any landowner either requires compensation or could obstruct or could object, and these things take time and are a risk in any infrastructure project of this nature. So the piping is a critical problem and an unknown cost at this point in time because you don't know how many there are. Then the next thing that you need at the borehole is you've got to have energy because you've got to pump water. I hear that the first boreholes they put down, they hit water at about 55, 56 meters, so let's call it 60 meters. So you've got to have a pump that with a head that can yield at least six bars of pressure or 60 meters of static water pressure. That will enable you to just dribble the water out of the surface. It won't give you a gushing pressure. So you need energy. You probably need at least a 6, maybe an 8-stage pump. For that, each stage in a pump will give you approximately 1 bar of pressure, ballpark numbers. And so now you've got to have an energy source reticulated to every one of your 10, your 100, or your 1,000 boreholes. That, once again, requires a servitude, not necessarily the same as the pipes, because your energy source is going to come either from overhead power lines or it's going to come from underground cables. That, once again, is open to theft, cable theft, all these sort of things. These things take time. But the third thing that you need, because the water that you're pumping out the ground now, you've got a general understanding of what the quality is, but you don't have the specific understanding. And the specific understanding, every borehole will have a slightly different geochemistry, slightly different factors at play. And only once you've tested those can you now determine what treatment you need on the borehole. Now the cost gets interesting, because when you're going to treat that borehole water to make it comply with SANS 241 standard, that's the National Health Standard for potable water. So are you going to treat every single borehole individually? It can be done, very costly. Or are you going to bring that together in one treatment plant for a well field? That's another cost. Are you going to feed that water into the overall reticulation system downstream of the existing water treatment plant or upstream? Why is that important? If you feed it into your existing reticulation system upstream of the current water treatment plant, then that water treatment plant will treat the water for you, and therefore the cost will be low. If you have to feed it into the system downstream of the water treatment plant, it means that effectively you've got to create a new water treatment plant. And these things could cost tens of millions of rand. In fact, sometimes hundreds of millions of rands, depending on the scale and the size of these things. All of these are cost factors. So in order to be honest and to inform the public in a way that they can make an honest decision, we need to insist that the city gives information on the three sources of water. And here we're talking about groundwater, we're talking about desalinated water, and we're talking about water recovered from waste. All three of those sources of water must be reduced as a cost per kiloliter, and then put on a spreadsheet table that says payback time over 2 years, over 10 years, over 20 years, over 30 years to get the different numbers. And of those, I haven't seen the final numbers, but the numbers that I have from more than one source now, confirmed tonight by the carte blanche piece, is that it is quite easy, quite conceivable. If you get the 30-year payback, it's quite conceivable to get your desalination water down to below 15 Rand a cubic meter, way below 15 Rand a cubic meter, which is the current cost of alleged current cost of groundwater. But the current cost of groundwater, as they're currently reporting it, does not report the actual cost of all the different pumps, all the different pipes, all the servitudes, all the power sources, all the water treatment plants. It completely externalizes all of those things. So those factors have to also all be brought in. And we have to compare an apple with an apple. And we have to have the fully internalized costs of all of the treatment of groundwater, along with the internalized cost of desalination water, because desalination water, the plant produces as an output SANS 241 quality water. It doesn't have to have an additional plant to produce it. It produces that as a final product. So I hope I've answered your question on the economics of it.
Yes, you have. Thank you very much for that detailed explanation.
I promise not to bombard you, but I mean, these things are inherently complex, but it's important that we just understand. We've got to understand that to inform the public that doesn't know about these things. This is a specialist field. The public has to understand these things in a way that the public can understand it. They have the right to know. And until such time as these complex things have been reduced to a way that the public can understand them, it means that the decision maker also doesn't understand it.
Excellent. Can I ask you also, can you explain why the full life cycle costing is essential to get a true cost of each option?
Yes, full life cycle costing is a concept that has been around the engineering domain increasingly over the last decade or so. Prior to that, the full life cycle costing wasn't done. And the full life cycle costing takes into consideration the full life cycle of a project, from the start of the project to the commissioning to the final decommissioning of that project. And full life cycle costing is when you internalize all of those externalities. And I'll tell you where it's played a very important role. And it's applicable to this conversation, but at another level. The coal lobby in South Africa has been very successful at maintaining a stranglehold on the energy sector by externalizing their costs, by not adopting a full life cycle cost structure. Because your full life cycle cost structure is the reason why we have the situation we have today in the goldfields, where we've now got almost all the gold mines have gone bankrupt. All the externalized costs are now manifesting as constraints to future development and are now a problem. So someone else has to pick up the baby. Someone else has to come and clean up the mess. Now, the full life cycle costing will internalize all of these different things, and it will enable us ultimately to say, over a 30-year reasonable lifespan of that machinery, of that equipment, this is what the net present value will be, because your financial analysts will model that. They will say, this is the net present value, and this is the discounted cash flow over time. And by doing that, they can give an honest and transparent cost per unit of water. And you will find that it is way below, way below the current numbers that have been thrown around. So until such time as we have full life cycle costing on all of these different technologies, we are not going to be able to compare an apple with an apple. We're going to be comparing an apple with a banana, and we're never going to get the answer.
Thank you. So now, another question that I'm trying to get through questions that people are asking that educate. Something that a lot of people want to know about desalination is that it produces brine, and people are concerned about the environmental impact that may have. Is that something that we should be concerned about? Is it going to add salt into the environment? What are the things? Is there a reason for concern?
Okay, whenever you have got a big plant producing desalinated water, you're going to have byproducts. And the one byproduct is brine. So what is in the water? Think of the water now as vegetable soup. So now you're taking your vegetable soup into your factory, and what your process is doing is it's taking out the peas and the cabbages and the potatoes and the tomatoes, and you're ending up now just with the water. So now you have to do something with the peas, cabbages, potatoes, and tomatoes. That's called brine, and that's got to go back into the ocean. Now, is that brine potentially damaging? Well, yes, it's potentially damaging if you discharge it into one spot in one site. And this is now where it gets interesting, where you talk about small package plants. Because small package plants are generally cheap. They're generally inexpensive. And because they're cheap, you plug it and you play it. So you don't have time or space or capital to go and site your drawdown point, where you get your feedstock out of the ocean, and your discharge point accurately. So if you have a big plant that I was talking about earlier, to get the efficiencies, the economies of scale needed to bring it down to below 10 Rand a cubic meter, then you have a proper set of discharge points, not one discharge point. You have a number of discharge points, and these can be out in the ocean. They can be a kilometer or more offshore, and they're properly engineered to go into an ocean current. So the discharge can potentially be harmful depending where you discharge it. But the other thing now is, and here it gets complicated, and I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself. The potatoes and the cabbages and the peas that I told you take out of this soup now comes from the ocean and is going to go back into the ocean. So you're not making the ocean more salty. The ocean stays exactly as salty as it was before the desalination process. Remember that the ocean covers 2/3 of the planet Earth, and the ocean is the source of almost all of the rainwater that falls over land. So the ocean naturally evaporates fresh water off the ocean, and it leaves behind brine. That's why the ocean is briny. So over billions and billions of years, the ocean becomes slightly more saline. But is a human impact on the southern tip of Africa going to make a measurable difference? And the answer there is, I don't think you will actually be able to statistically measure the impact, provided you cite it correctly. So it comes down to proper engineering, proper design. And I'll give you an example. The CSIR, when I was involved with CSIR, did a study some years back of the Okavango. And the Okavango, Namibia was going to build a pipeline from the panhandle of the Okavango. And there was a concern that the pipeline would reduce the volume through the Okavango, therefore it'd have an impact over the entire Okavango. And the impact of that was found to be, by credible peer-reviewed scientists, international scientists, to be so small that it could not be measured with modern available technologies. So yes, there will be an impact immediately at the discharge point. It can be managed, but the significance of that in the overall scheme of things is very, very low. Compare that again now to other existing impacts. For example, the existing impact of discharging raw sewage out to the ocean, which is way, 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 way more significant than the discharge of brine.
I've got a question here from someone in the audience before I ask you the last question. Let me put that on screen. How do you measure aquifer recharge in order to keep from excessive pumping or usage?
That's a lovely, lovely, very good question. Now, the current consultants to the groundwater team, I put out a public question a while ago on Facebook, and I asked a question. I said, have you calculated sustainable yield? And I gave them the opportunity to make a public statement, which they chose not to do. And they got in touch with me privately. And I can't reveal the contents of their private email because it was a confidential email. But in effect, what they're saying is that this is not really a relevant factor. That in essence, that's what they're saying. And I wish they would put it out in public, because then the public would have a chance to see with their own eyes exactly what it's about. It comes down to what is known in the water resource profession as a mass balance. Mass balance is, you've got a certain volume of water, and you're going to take a certain volume of water out, and a certain volume of water comes in. If the out and the in is balanced over time, then you will have equilibrium. If you're taking more out than you're putting in, then the level's going to drop. Quite straightforward. It's no complicated numbers to that. Okay? So when it comes to groundwater gets a little bit more complicated, because We can't see it down there. It's a mysterious place. And the Earth is not a homogeneous sponge-like structure. There are all kinds of things. There's geological tectonic activity that's taken place, and dikes and sills and all these kind of things that alter the flow. But typically, an aquifer would be modeled as a kind of homogeneous unit simply because there's no other better way of doing it. Okay, they use what's called a finite element analysis software package to try and build up these layers of knowledge as they go along. Each hole that's drilled, they get different strata of rock, or what's called stratigraphy, and from that they can actually map the different porosity and what they call storativity and retention values and transmissivity. These are all mathematical values that are put into a great big spreadsheet that help you to figure out what's going on. But the bottom line is that an aquifer is a buildup of water over time that has typically come from either the ground, either above ground in the form of rainfall, and that's called infiltrated water that has fallen on the ground, that has become rainwater, that's become soil water that is picked up by plants in the root zone. And if that water continues down past the depths where the roots can no longer reach it, it now starts becoming shallow groundwater, and it eventually becomes deeper groundwater. So it's that fraction of the total volume. And I think, I can't give you the exact numbers because they differ from place to place, but as a ballpark number, I think you'd have something like about 1% of the total volume of rainfall that falls would eventually infiltrate into the ground. Something like 1%. And something like 3% of that water would eventually, maybe 5% of that water would eventually flow off the surface into a river. So groundwater is charged either by natural recharge through rainfall coming in on the surface, a long, slow process, or it is recharged by a river. When a river flows over the ground and your river loses water to the ground and your river recharges it. And sometimes the groundwater flows into the river, vice versa. And that's called surface water groundwater interface. And there's a lot of interesting things that happen there. But ultimately, it comes down to this mass balance. How much water is going in through natural processes versus how much water are you abstracting out? That's what you have to balance. And that is measured over time in a number of ways. They're complicated mathematical ways. But ultimately, unless you balance out what you take out, unless you put in roughly what you take out over time, you're going to slowly draw that aquifer down. Now, you can do that for a short period of time, for a few years, maybe even a decade. You can do it. The aquifer can be abused if you like. They are fairly tough things down there, okay? But you can't do it in a sustainable way forever and ever. That's simply not possible. So ultimately, as a crude number, the water that you take out, that you're pumping out, that you will know about because you would have a meter on every borehole, that volume of water has to go back in some form, either natural rainfall, natural stream flow, or you would have to actively charge that in what is known as managed aquifer recharge or aquifer storage and recovery. Now, that's a clever thing to do because I personally cannot see a future for the city of Cape Town in an arid, semi-arid area other than moving away from total reliance on surface storage and dams, because as climate change kicks in more, as our loss to evaporation is growing, because this is what happens under these conditions, your dams are going to become increasingly just open pan evaporation ponds. And it makes a lot of sense to store the water underground. So that gets back to my opening statement tonight, that it's not a question of one technology over the other. It's a question of how do you use those technologies conjunctively and how do you optimize those? That is where some of the Australian mistakes were made, where they went just for desalination, for example, and now those have become a bit of a white elephant. So that's why you've got to have a real proper long-term plan, calm and relax, think about the options, do all the mass balances, look at all of the options, and ultimately do a proper cost-benefit analysis, communicate that to the public, because ultimately it's a public money that you spend.
One of the questions that I have from another viewer is, when can we expect to have aquifer water in the reticulation system, and how long will it take to produce under perfect conditions? Is that a question you can answer?
Well, look, it's a kind of hypothetical, and hypotheticals are always difficult to answer. So let me just say, under perfect conditions, Let's assume that the water quality is good. I'm told that some of the aquifers yield very remarkably good water. Let's say it is SANS 241 compliant. You could conceivably have some of that water into the system within 2 months. The question now is, it goes back to there was a radio interview a day or two ago with I think Peter Flower it was, and in that interview he made it clear that there is uncertainty about how fast the groundwater is going to be brought online, and even when and if it's brought online, it's going to be a relatively small percentage of the total volume needed. So that's another question that I'm not able to answer at the moment. But technically, you can bring groundwater online fairly quickly, but then it's got to be done properly. But then you've got these externalities that must be honestly reported. The cost per borehole, the cost of the number of motors, the number of pumps, the number of cables, all of those things that I spoke about earlier on also have to be reported. You can't conveniently forget about that and say, oh, the borehole costs 50,000 rand to drill, 50,000 rand to equip, 100,000 rand for the borehole. That divided by the volume coming out of there is the total price per cubic meter. Doesn't quite work like that, because you have other externalities that you also have to consider. So once again, your full life cycle costing methodology would enable those numbers to be honestly captured and reported in the public interest.
It's another interesting question here, asking about whether or not our farmers should be switching to a drip system to avoid evaporation.
I think that's also a fantastic question. So let me just sort of answer that. It is a no-brainer. I've been doing quite a bit of work professionally in the last couple of years in the sugar industry. And what's very interesting in the sugar industry, it's a very water-thirsty industry. And I've been working in Swaziland for the last 18 months. And Swaziland uses overhead irrigation of sugar. And the drought that's hit them now means that they can no longer do that. So what they're now starting to do is they're starting to go for drip irrigation. And what that does is, think of a plant, either a tree or a grapevine or whatever. But where you need the water is in the roots. But when rainfall falls, that water will fall on the total surface area of all of the leaves. Now, if you just take a typical tree, for example, just take a fruit tree. The Western Cape produces lots of deciduous fruit. So let's just take a peach tree or an apple tree. An apple tree, if you take the combined surface area of every leaf on that apple tree, it will come to many square meters, maybe even half the size of a tennis court. I don't know, but it'll be a large area. Now, if you're applying irrigation with sprinklers, you are leaving a thin layer of water over all of the leaves, which is doing nothing for the vegetation. It is simply evaporating. So modern trends nowadays are to what is known as fertigation, where you put fertilizer and irrigation in a controlled, even computer-controlled way at the root level of every plant. Now, this is a no-brainer for agriculture. I'm told that some of the more progressive farms in the Western Cape are doing it already. This is simply the way of staying in business. And all you need is a 5 or 10% improvement in your total use of agricultural water, and you will have more than enough for domestic use for the next 50 years. So that also brings another interesting conversation to the table. You cannot look at the farmers as the enemy. Under these circumstances, people want to fight with the farmers. Oh, look at the farmers, they're getting lots of water and we can't bath. The farmers are your friend. They feed you, they create employment, but they also are one of the best sources of producing efficiencies in the overall national system. Remember, at national level, that's national, that's not at the Western Cape level, at national level, your total volume of water allocated to agriculture is the order of 61 to 63%. Let's call it 62%. That's the total. In Western Cape, I believe it's slightly less. But that's 2/3 of your total national water budget. If just a 10% saving there is more than enough for us to have a stable and vibrant economy going forward. Farmers, your friend. Technology is your friend.
I think that I think that kind of debunks, I'm glad you clarified that, because there's been a lot of questions flying around about the amount of water that farmers are allowed. Some people feel they shouldn't be getting the water, and I'm glad that you've answered that question as to why our farmers should be getting the allotment of water. There's some more questions here. One question is, do we have desalination companies who are able to build desalination plants locally, and why are we looking at international companies?
We have at least 3 major desalination plants based in South Africa, at least 3. One of them has built some of the most sophisticated desalination plants in the acid mine drainage space. And when we talk about brine disposal, the one particular company, I don't want to mention names because then it sounds like I'm favoring one company over the other, but this particular company has looked at brine, because brine disposal in the hinterland of the country is different to brine disposal at sea. You can't just discharge large volumes of brine into the felt of the high felt. You've got to have a dam. And brine is funny stuff. It has got certain physical characteristics. It never dries up. So you can evaporate the water off it and it stays like a jelly, like a mushy jelly. It's like wet salt. Salt never ever dries up either. It always attracts moisture. Okay, it is hydrophilic, not hydrophobic. Hydrophilic means it attracts water. So what they've cleverly done is they've said that their biggest cost of production, in fact, is brine disposal. So they've used technology that has come from UCT. Eutectic technology, it's called. Eutectic, it refers to the freezing of the brine stream at different temperatures below zero. And at different temperatures below zero, you get different chemistry kicking in. So what they do is they mine the brine stream for chemically pure substances. And now here's the mind-blowing bit. They've got a 99% recovery of water. All of the other desal for ocean water generally talks about a 1/3 recovery, 2/3 going back as brine, but that's the easiest, quickest, lowest hanging fruit to get. Okay, so it's technically possible to reduce your brine stream with a South African company using UCT technology know-how. Okay, so it's locally available technology, world-class technology. Okay, that's the one company. The other company has built a number of plants all over the world. Is based in the Western Cape. They've offered their services. It's no secret that they've offered their services already. They are world class. Then there's yet another company, a South African company, a listed company, that built one of the largest desalination plants in the Southern African region at a place called Trekkoppie in Namibia, near Swakopmund. And I was there the day they opened that plant. The plant, I'm told, has now been mothballed because the price of uranium has tanked. But that plant at the time when it was built was the biggest single desalination plant in Southern Africa. And here we have a South African listed company doing it. So the technology doesn't belong to any country. It doesn't belong to any entity, but you've got different local companies with the skill sets and, more importantly, with a capital structure behind them to actually roll these things out as a very, very low-cost solution. So we need to give these companies an honest chance. And that's all I'm fighting for. I'm just fighting for an honest chance. I'm not siding with any of these companies. I just want an honest cost per cubic meter, all these different technologies, all externalities internalized. That's all I want. And then let the public decide on a 2, 10, and 30-year payback period. And then you, as the public, be the deciding factor.
Anthony, a question here from Marissa says, why is SAB allowed to get 97% water free from the Newland Springs? The farmers' produce also needs water. I know that this agreement with SAB was done a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's a hot potato. Should it be reviewed? Can it be reviewed?
I am familiar with
any benefit? Yeah.
I am familiar with the SAB project. And look, firstly, SAB, in my view, has always been a very, very environmentally sensitive company. So, let me give you some facts here. SA Breweries, as a company, led the charge in this whole idea of water footprinting. So if you look at any of the water footprinting literature, you'll always go back to SAB Miller. And SAB Miller asked a very simple question as a global company. They said, how much water does it take to produce 1 liter of beer in any of the countries that they operate in? And ironically, they found through that process that producing beer in South Africa is one of the least efficient places to produce beer. It's more efficient to produce beer in Czechoslovakia and those sort of places where there's lots of natural rainfall. And it comes down to, I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 300 odd liters of water produce 1 liter of beer. And that's the input cost of on the upstream side of all of your hops and your barley and your sugar and all that stuff that goes into your beer. But it's also the water needed to dilute your effluent coming out. And I think it's roughly about half that number in a place like Czechoslovakia. You'll have to just get those numbers. There will be lots of water footprinting numbers out there. Just Google them to get the exact numbers. But it's roughly in that ballpark. So the question now is firstly, does SA breweries have a right to that water? Well, they will be treated like any other water user in South Africa, and they will have a permission to use that water resource for a defined period of time within certain parameters. And that's it. That's what they have. They don't have an undisputed right. And now it gets to be very, very interesting, and I'll give you 2 case studies here. The one case study was in one of the provinces in India, one of the states in India, where there was not Tamil Nadu, I forget the name of the state, I think of the name now. But there was a tremendous drought in that particular Indian state. And Coca-Cola was producing a product there. And what eventually happened was there was such social mobilization around that particular plant that it became a political movement to put pressure on the government to take the water license away from Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola lost its water license in that particular state. And that became a watermark case in the whole water as a risk space that I'm working in, as you mentioned in the introduction. So with that, now other companies, for example, Nike that produces shoes, they suddenly said, "Whoa, this is we could risk losing our license." Texas Instruments that makes chips for computers, they said, "Whoa, we could lose our license." Okay, so they suddenly became very, very environmentally conscious. So with that, I would argue that SA breweries, like the farmers, is your friend. You want to talk to them. They already have made their spring. It's not their spring. It's a public resource that they've been given permission to use because all water is nationalized. It all belongs to the state. So they've got permission to use that. And as a good social corporate citizen, they would make it available to the public. If they don't, there will be rioting and ultimately they'll lose their license. So then you've got to ask the question, what value add does SA Breweries Newlands have? How many jobs do they create? Do they export the product? Where's the benefit of that? Ultimately, it's part of your local economy. And these are numbers that have to be done at a macroeconomic level. I can't give you the answers to that. But ultimately, all of your water users are producing an economic output that is of value. They're paying taxes somewhere along the line. They're paying for infrastructure somewhere along the line. They're employing people. So they're not necessarily the evil people. And it's a question of structuring your conversation with them. And let me just throw in another interesting thing here now. I was in lunch this last week with the chairman of a big multinational corporation, and he told me something very interesting that I'm going to be writing about very, very soon. So let me give you a sneak preview about this. He works at global level, and with my hat on as the editor of the Journal Water Policy, the official journal of the World Water Council, I've also got a reasonable global view of water policy related matters. And what he said suddenly struck me as being very vitally important for what's happening in Cape Town right now. So let me share what he said to me. He said to me that the strange, bizarre thing in South Africa, and he can't understand it as a foreigner, he said to me, why is it that the unit cost of water is so high in South Africa for individual consumers, for private people, for Joe Blogs, for you, the final end user? Why is it that the individual has to pay such a high price for water on the one hand, and yet your industrial and bulk users have to pay a lower price? And he said to me, everywhere else in the world, it's the other way around. And then he explained why that's important. Because you're seeing it now in all of the protest action taking place in Cape Town. People have saved as much as they can. They're starting to take baths in protest now. People cannot bath less than they're bathing. They cannot flush the toilet less than they're flushing at the moment. You can't squeeze blood out of stone. You can't expect those same people that are saving now to now go and pay a punitive tax for having saved. The economics are screwed up. So the way he explains to me, I'm going to hopefully explain it correctly now to you. If you have a higher tariff for industrial users, you now make their production cost that much higher. Therefore, you incentivize them to become more efficient and to recycle or reuse or reduce. And if you just get a small saving in industry, you're going to have more than enough saving for your domestic consumption. So, in other words, by pricing the water the way we do in South Africa, we penalize the individual consumer that is being good, that is being a good, honest citizen that is trying to save. We're saying, you've saved, thank you very much for saving, we're now going to slap a big tax on you for saving saved. That's a disincentive. So we're going to see, I think, coming out of this Cape Town crisis and this whole backlash, public backlash against that drought tariff is probably going to become a national movement, I would think, over time. And it's going to eventually force, I think, and I really hope it does, it's going to force a logical rethink of the way that we price water in this country. Because we're pricing water in a way that incentivizes bad behavior. And we cannot afford to do that post day zero.
I'm going to take one last question from the audience. Kobus Conradi asks whether we should not be bulldozing our dams and making them deeper and flattening them out to eliminate the pockets of water and create channels to get the water to the extraction points. Is that a possible solution? Not a short-term solution anyway, but
it comes down to
considering that?
It comes down to the simple old engineering thing of a cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost of moving the earth versus what is the benefit that you get out of it? And you see, you try those things when it's when you have a drought. You can do those things. And I've heard of some farming communities up in the Stellenbosch area that have done just that. They've evidently at their own cost, they've deepened their dams, etc. And evidently they're doing quite well at the moment now. So to the best of my knowledge, it is not economically viable to do that because the volumes of earth are just too big. But I mean, that's an open debate from a mainstream water resource management perspective. It's not done simply because the cost benefit doesn't stack up. I've also seen some mention in various social media about canals to channel water into dams. This is a misnomer. Canals do not channel water into a dam. Rivers do. So water will flow off a mountain, to flow off the natural flow paths wherever it falls as rainfall. It will go through a wetland and eventually into a little stream and eventually into a river. And that's called a catchment area or a watershed, and that will eventually end up in a river. So rivers fill dams, not canals. What you can get is feeding out of a dam. You can get an irrigation canal taking water out of a dam. So that takes water out of a dam, not into a dam. So we also need to get that right because I've seen some people talk about they visited some dams and the canals are overgrown and they haven't got water. Well, of course not. There's a drought on the go, and if there's a drought, there's no rain. There's no water flowing. And canals take water out the dam. They don't put water into the dam. And this is a very important factual issue that we need to clarify.
Thanks, Anthony. There's one more final question I'd like to ask you because I hear this a lot in social media. With regards to the springs, a lot of the water is flowing into the ocean. I know there's a lot of controversy at the moment. People are saying, why is water not made available from the springs 24/7? Why don't we get access all the time? Because that water is running away anyway. So the water that's running into the sea, is that water wasted?
That is a fantastic question. In fact, I engaged in social media somewhere today just on that very topic. So I'm going to repeat what I've said there. Okay? Human beings have profoundly impacted the natural hydrological flows. If we had not built dams, etc., we would not have human civilization as we know it today. Civil engineering is called civil engineering because we build civils. We build civilization with civil engineering. It comes from ancient Rome, the first time that they could have people living together in a way without disease by bringing water into the city, the growing city, by aqueducts and taking it out into the river as sewage. That's what they did in Rome. So water flowing into the ocean is not wasted, not by any stretch of imagination. If you take a holistic view of it, the ocean is part of a global ecosystem. And the global ecosystem is about flowing temperatures, flowing water, flowing nutrients over land, through space, etc., through space and time. So water flowing into the ocean performs a lot of useful functions. And in fact, somebody this morning engaged with me on social media about brine discharge in the Sedgefield area, saying that brine discharge was causing a tremendous impact in that area. And I don't dispute it, no, but part of the problem is that we've so depleted our natural return flows. If you go along the coast of KZN, hardly any of those rivers flow into the ocean anymore. They almost all end up in a lagoon. We've completely destroyed that the surface, the land and the ocean interface, which is through an estuary. And the estuaries are where things happen. So in an estuary, for example, you get fresh water coming into the estuary, and fresh water, by virtue of the physics and chemistry of water, is lighter, it's less dense than salt water, and it floats on top of fresh water. So in an estuary, you get what's called a saline wedge. That wedge moves back and forward. If you think of an estuary here, and think of this wedge, a saline wedge. This is the ocean here, because your salt water goes underneath your fresh water. Fresh water floats on top of the salt water. And this wedge moves back and forth with each tide. So at any point in a functioning estuary, at some time you'll have fresh water, at some time you'll have salt water. And it's that alternation of fresh and saline that actually drives a lot of ecological processes. So when we talk about stopping every drop of water flowing into the ocean, we are now talking about ultimately destroying your spawning sites, etc. I was working about the last 3 months ago. I was working in Australia, up in Queensland, in Australia. And what's interesting on the whole western coast of Australia, you get these rivers, relatively short rivers, that are flowing into the ocean, onto the Great Barrier Reef. And because of all of the interaction of agriculture and mining inland, the flood pulse of these rivers has been altered, the nutrient quality has been altered, and one of the problems now is that the Great Barrier Reef is now starting to have all kinds of ecological problems. So bottom line is that water is not wasted. And in fact, where this has been learned very, very starkly is in the United States of America, where they had a government department called the Bureau for Reclamation. And go and read it, Google it. Read a book called Cadillac Desert by a famous author called Mark Reisner. And he speaks about this with very eloquent. And now the Bureau for Reclamation was set up to reclaim the desert for man, to reclaim the desert back from nature. So what they did, Los Angeles is all about the Bureau of Reclamation. If you look at that movie, that TV program, Swamp People, you see these people going into the swamps of Louisiana, and you'll see these aerial views of these long, straight channels. You'll see that New Orleans that flooded, all because of the Bureau for Reclamation. They've reclaimed wetlands, and they've reclaimed deserts, and now nature bites back because it's lost its flood attenuation capability, your spawning has stopped, your ecological functioning stopped, etc., etc. So water flowing into the ocean is not necessarily lost. It's a question of doing decent things with it and being responsible as a steward. The whole notion of water stewardship is now emerging as a global phenomenon, or as a custodian. If we are custodians, and you see this happening a lot now in Cape Town, people are acutely becoming aware of their custodial role. And this is what we have to. I would almost like to see Cape Town becoming the leader in Africa now for the water, for the stewardship of water. Even setting up a global conference, for example, about how to make a city a resilient city by managing water and energy and food better. Those sort of things. You could turn this crisis into a tremendous future industry, if you like, growth point, just by understanding. Because what you are learning now as a society is going to ultimately become the blueprint for this whole new policy and water management framework for our country going forward, and possibly even other countries as well.
Dr. Anthony Turton, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, appreciate your passion for this water crisis, and really appreciate that you take your time to share such valuable information with us. And I like the positive note on which we're ending that we can actually turn this around and use this crisis as a huge opportunity, and have something positive come out of it. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, listeners, for joining with us. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for sharing the broadcast. And thank you for joining us this evening. So from myself, Bridgetti Limbanda, and from Dr. Anthony Turton, goodbye and thank you very much again.
Goodbye. Thank you.